One Red Air Force colonel pointed out that there was no need to distract the pilot with a lot of fancy gadgets. From 1941 to 1945, more than 37,000 aircraft belonging to this family of fighters were produced. It was the most successful all-round Russian fighter of the Great Patriotic War. Artyom Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurievich's MiG design bureau was not as successful as Yakovlev in designing a fighter to meet the needs of aerial warfare over Russia and the Ukraine. The MiG-1 and MiG-3 were designed to perform well at high altitudes. They did, but unfortunately the realities of the Great Patriotic War called for lower altitude performance, and here the MiGs with their light airframe and large engine experienced handling difficulties. Also, they used the same engine as the Ilyushin Shturmovik, which was considered more important for the war effort and given priority. In the battle for Moscow, MiG-1s were available in greater numbers than the other new fighters, and they performed with distinction alongside the few Yaks and Lags available at the time. Later, they served with tactical reconnaissance squadrons, making better use of their speed and high-altitude capability. But one of Russia's greatest fighter pilots, Alexander Pakryshkin, loved the MiG-3. He used its high-altitude capability to develop a new approach to fighter tactics, closing the gap between the skills of Soviet pilots and those of the Luftwaffe. The MiG-3 was a major factor in developing his technique. He said, "I decided the thing was to fight more boldly in a vertical plane." He would spot enemy formations from high altitude and dive down, attacking where they were weakest. Other Soviet pilots saw his results and followed his lead. Severe losses as the war dragged on forced radical changes in organization of the Air Force. In May 1942, General Alexander Novikov issued an edict. In the interest of increasing striking force, it is ordered to combine the air forces of the Western Front into a unified air army. The air armies were designed to be flexible enough to respond rapidly to changes in the strategic situation. While each was assigned to support its ground army front, control and responsibility was placed in the hands of the air army commander. Losses of experienced pilots had been high, and new pilots were often briefly and inadequately trained. New controls were introduced. No pilot could break off from a dogfight without orders or abandon bomber escort duty. Forward observation stations were established on the ground just behind the front lines to provide radio guidance to fighter aircraft. Often, especially in cloudy conditions, these stations could track an enemy aircraft as it took refuge in cloud cover and relay an account of its movements to the pursuing Soviet pilot. An air army could be made up of divisions of fighter, ground attack aircraft, and bombers. Bomber and Sturmovik divisions often had their own fighter regiments for escort and reconnaissance. As a result of the heavy losses of 1941 and 42, the size of fighter units was reduced. The new fighter regiments had 30 aircraft each, divided into 3 squadrons of 10. The 10 squadron members were subdivided into a pair made up of the leader and his number 2 and 2 flights of 4 aircraft each. Regimental commanders and squadron leaders flew with their units and were expected to observe and monitor their new pilots. Even in 1943, confidence was a problem for the inexperienced Russians. The reputation of the Luftwaffe was daunting for young men just out of a training program that was often inadequate. Their tendency to scatter under pressure made them easy targets for the experienced Germans, and in spite of reorganization and education, it remained a problem throughout the war. As the war continued into 1944, the Soviet fighter regiments gained a dominance over the Luftwaffe. It was largely numerical, brought about by the miracle of increasing production in the factories behind the Ural Mountains and mounting losses of Luftwaffe fighters that could not be replaced by German industry. In 1942, a new Russian fighter emerged to challenge the eminence of the Yaks. It was the Lavochkin LA-5, a direct descendant of the Lag-3, the guaranteed varnished coffin. The LA-5 was no guaranteed coffin. It was still largely wooden, but a new radial engine and some design modifications transformed it into an aircraft able to outperform new Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters at altitudes below 12,000 feet. In 1943, the LA-7 emerged. It was a redesigned and improved version of the LA-5FN and proved itself to be the most advanced Soviet fighter in the Great Patriotic War. Stalin was so impressed with its performance that he awarded Semyon Lavochkin a special prize of 100,000 rubles. The LA-7 had a radial engine that produced 1,800 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of almost 420 miles an hour. There had been problems in development. In 1942, there were two incidents where the wings of LA-5s broke in flight. At first, there were rumors of sabotage, but eventually the problem was found to be worn drill bits. They drilled holes in the wing attachments too small to take the bolts. Assembly workers were using hefty hammer blows to force them in. The structure was weakened and it failed under stress. The LA-7 was armed with two 23mm cannon located in the upper cowling. Hard points under the wings allowed armament loads of 330 pounds of bombs or 6 rockets. This is the aircraft flown by the top Russian ace of the Great Patriotic War, Ivan Khazhedub. His career began in March 1943 in an LA-5, and he moved to the LA-7 in July 1944. He flew 520 sorties and had a total of 62 kills, including 22 Focke-Wulfs and 19 Messerschmitts. By the end of the Great Patriotic War, over 200 Soviet pilots had each destroyed more than 20 German aircraft. Khazhedub and the second-ranking Russian ace, Alexander Pakryshkin, were each awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. Khazhedub's record is remarkable because, as a brilliant instructor, he was held back from combat for a year and a half. At one point, he had 11 victories in 10 days. More than 10,000 Lavochkin LA-5 FNs emerged from fighter plant number 21 at Gorky, east of Moscow. From 1944 onwards, reconstituted factories at Yaroslavl and Moscow turned out more than 5,000 LA-7s. The immense quantities of munitions to arm and support them poured from factories scattered out of reach of German bombers. But the Great Patriotic War was not fought without some external assistance. This is an American Bell P-63 King Cobra, delivered to Russia late in the war under the Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease began in October 1941. The principal fighter aircraft supplied to the Russians was the Bell P-39 Aerocobra. 4,700 were delivered to the Soviet Union via Alaska and Siberia in the course of the war. The Aerocobra was not popular with American pilots because of its poor high-altitude performance, but the Soviet pilots found that it performed well as a low-altitude fighter. Its 37mm cannon made it an effective ground attack aircraft, and it had excellent radio communication. Russian authorities have tended to downplay the effect of Lend-Lease as a factor in Soviet victory, but among fighter aircraft, and especially early in the war, it was important. In 1943, after more than 2 years of desperate struggle under conditions of extreme hardship, the Soviet Union took the upper hand in the Great Patriotic War. The influence of fighter aircraft in the eventual Soviet victory has to be seen in the context of the overall military effort. Fighters supported bombers and Sturmovik raids in the air and infantry and artillery efforts on the ground. They took part in dogfights, and they helped enforce blockades of areas under German control. The fact that Russian fighter aircraft, in such a sorry state of obsolescence in 1939, could evolve so quickly and become so competitive with their superb German opponents by the middle years of the war is one of the extraordinary aspects of the Soviet military recovery. This is the Yakovlev Yak-9, the final point of evolution of the Yak fighters during the Great Patriotic War. It was a development of the Yak-7 and responded to Stalin's demands to his fighter designers for longer range. To achieve this, Yakovlev sacrificed the wooden construction of the wings. Instead of wood, the wing spars were made of lightweight metal, and this allowed larger fuel cells to be installed within the wing structure. Cannon fired through the propeller shaft, and the aircraft also carried either 1 or 2 machine guns. The Yak-9 was ready in time to take part in the Battle of Stalingrad, where, fighting alongside the new Lavochkin La-5, it became a major new factor in the aerial war. All Russian fighter aircraft used wood in some part of their construction until 1944, when the Yak-9U with an all-metal airframe was introduced. It was to remain the only Soviet fighter aircraft of the war with no wooden components. Of the 37,000 Yakovlev fighters built during the Great Patriotic War, 17,000 were Yak-9s. There were many variants, including fighter-bomber, long-range fighter, night interceptor, reconnaissance, and trainer versions. Each one maintained the simplicity and robust strength that had made the Yak-1 a success from the time it first flew. The Yak-9 was a perfect culmination of Stalin's preference for simplicity and quantity over technological refinement.